just one day after a jury in New York found him guilty of 34 criminal charges. This hour, President Biden will have his chance to possibly speak out publicly for the first time as he's leaving Delaware. Both campaigns right now looking to capitalize off this truly uncharted territory type moment the country finds itself in once again. July 11th is now the newest key date leading up to the November election. That date, July 11th, is when Donald Trump is scheduled to face sentencing. That's just 4 days before the Republican convention of Republicans would formally nominate him to be their presidential candidate. CNN's Kristen Holmes and Bryn Gingras are live inside and outside Trump Tower, I think is what I'm looking at. Kristen, take us inside first. Donald Trump says he's holding a press conference. What are you hearing he could say?
Well, Kate, I wouldn't expect to hear anything different from what he has been saying, that this case was election interference, that it should have never been brought, it was political persecution, and probably trying to link this without any evidence to President Joe Biden. And the reason why he has continued to repeat this rhetoric is because his team thinks that this helps him in November, that it riles up the base, that it really helps rally Republicans around the former president. Now, I will note that there are several advisors and allies to the former president who will acknowledge that they are in uncharted territory. They don't know what is going to happen. They are feeling good after getting a lot of fundraising numbers. They haven't given them to us yet, but they say that they really took in a lot of donations in the last 24 hours. Of course, we'll wait to see what those numbers look like, but they still don't know. And I want to talk about a recent poll that came out, and it was specifically about people who said that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. 7% of those people said they were less likely to vote for him if he was convicted. Now, his team has told me they don't believe that. They don't believe that number. They believe that this is actually going to help him, but that margin is pretty big when you consider that both Trump and Biden believe that this margin, that this election is going to be determined by a very small number of voters. And when you talk about 7% of Trump's base, the people that always turn out for the former president, that could be a problem. But again, I will note, his advisors are saying right now they are feeling good because of the fact that the former president has gotten so many calls from allies, lawmakers, donors, saying they are standing by him and they are donating to his campaign.
Kristen, stick with us. Let's get to Bryn, who's outside Trump Tower right now. Bryn, what is happening next in terms of the legal front?
Yeah, Kate, first let me just show you some of the headlines that Americans are waking up to this morning, at least in New York. Guilty on the Daily News, guilty of all 34 counts for the New York Times, and an injustice is what the New York Post is calling it. And it's headlines, and you're right, we've got the next step in this process that has taken several weeks, of course. That is the sentencing date, July 11th, 10 a.m. There are a few things that are actually going to work into Judge Juan Merchan's decision. Let me tick through those points. One, he's going to factor in the fact that the former president does not have a criminal history. Also, the fact that these convictions, well, they're not violent felonies, so that will likely play into his decision, as well as he'll get a recommendation from a probation officer that is going to interview Donald Trump ahead of the sentencing date, and of course Donald Trump's family and friends can send along some character references as well. As far as the punishment Trump could receive when it comes to these convictions, well, in the state of New York, it could be anywhere from 4 years rather in prison for each of those 34 counts, but a maximum of 20 years, which is basically the most that someone can receive for these types of felonies. And of course, probation is also an option that Juan Merchan can recommend, or to hand down rather, I should say. Let's listen though to the DA, Alvin Bragg, what he had to say after these convictions were handed down.
We were indicted for conduct that happened in 2015, 16, 17, in a jurisdiction that it was very hard for us to get a fair trial. I think it's naive to say that this is like any other case.
We arrived at this trial, and ultimately today at this verdict, in the same manner as every other case that comes to the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law, and doing so without fear or favor.
Yeah, and you heard Bragg there's really sticking to the script, not really going off that. Even so, when he was asked point blank, what is he going to recommend to the judge at the sentencing, saying he's going to let his court filing speak for itself. You also heard from the lead defense counsel, Todd Blanche, there talking to Caitlin Collins, basically saying that they are ready to be filing motions ahead of this sentencing date. And then after that, of course, they plan to appeal. Kate?
Bryn, thank you. Kristen Holmes, inside Trump Tower, as we're going to be hearing from Donald Trump in very shortly.
All right, with us now, CNN legal analyst, criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson, and former federal prosecutor Jennifer Rogers. The Trump team says they will appeal. How hard is it to win on appeal in New York State?
Well, it depends what your arguments are. On some things like sufficiency of the evidence at trial, it's very hard, right? It's very hard to overturn a jury's verdict. But some of these legal issues that Judge Merchan ruled on before trial, those are legal issues. They don't rely on a witness's credibility, that sort of thing. So those will be evaluated legally by the Court of Appeals, the intermediate court, and then ultimately perhaps the Court of Appeals. So those are easier because the standard is lower.
But what is then the strongest argument against an appeal? I mean, Todd Blanche is definitely moving ahead with it. You speak to any of the surrogates, as we have supporters of Donald Trump, they list out all of the reasons they think this wasn't fair and why he didn't get a fair shake. But
yeah, Kate, good morning, John, Jennifer. Look, the bottom line is there's not many reasons against an appeal, Kate, because you want appeals. That's our system of justice, and that's how you exhaust the system. And if there's any error, and just to be clear, what you're appealing is not the jury got it wrong. You're appealing whether there was evidence before the jury that perhaps should not have been before, or evidence that the jury didn't see that perhaps they should have. Those are judicial rulings. I think another thing that's going to be significant is the issue as to how we got to the felony. And how we got to the felony, somewhat technical, but you have to first conclude that there's this fraudulent ledger, invoices, and the checks, and then you have to make the leap with respect to the concealment of this other crime. What is concerning is that as to that leap, you just have to determine that it was an unlawful purpose. You can decide smorgasbord what unlawful it is to you, and that's somewhat troubling to me. I think there should be a specific delineated other crime, not, well, it could be campaign finance, it could be tax, well, I think it's this. If the jurors could have a different assessment with respect to what it is, but could conclude it was unlawful and therefore he's guilty, that to me is troubling. That certainly will be an issue for appeal.
So, one of the things that we've heard from Trump surrogates over the last 12 hours or so is they expected this. They expected a commission. I'm not sure I buy that. I think they had all talked themselves into a hung jury. I really do. If you listen to what they had said in the days and hours, even while they were deliberating, I think that's where they were. So I just want that as framing. Jen, if you could talk to a juror this morning to find out what went on in the room and their thoughts process, what would you want to know most?
I'd want to know the whole thing, right? I mean, we don't get to know any of it, but, really, I think where they started, because oftentimes they'll take kind of an initial vote to take the temperature, and then like how it progressed. How do you persuade your fellow jurors? Because that's what they're doing. When they ask for things like a readback of certain testimony or the judge's instructions again, they're using that to persuade their fellow jurors. This is a negotiation among the jurors. And then finally, this was 34 counts of guilty. A lot of people thought that they might split that up. They might find the checks that Donald Trump wrote to be guilty, the other ones not guilty, somehow compromise on that, but they didn't. 34 counts of guilty. So what happened there? Did they talk at all about splitting up those counts in any way and finding some guilty, some not guilty, or were they just, on it for the whole time?
And there's also now lots of questions around sentencing come July 11th. One thing I'm wondering is we're waiting to hear from Donald Trump this morning. Between now and July 11th, is Donald Trump's public commentary and what he will say about the verdict, and can that impact sentencing?
Kate, I think it's fair game. And the reason I believe that is because of the issue of remorse, right? And the issue of the lack thereof. And I think it's false to presume that he won't get any jail. Now, let me be clear. There'll be bail pending appeal.
Right.
What that means is if he is, for example, sentenced to an incarceratory sentence and the judge remands him, I think that there will be an opportunity to submit bail and have it go through the legal process before he serves any time. But let's be clear about this. There are people at Rikers Island on misdemeanor offenses, right? There are people who are sentenced to jail because their lawyers take pleas from felonies down to misdemeanors to do jail. But I think that an essential thing with the judge is going to be respect for the judicial system. Look, I know it's a campaign. You can wax poetic, corrupt judge, corrupt DA, this, that, the other. but you got to accept some responsibility. 34 counts. We have a jury system, and that 12 jurors concluded you're guilty. And just to absolve yourself of all sin because it's Biden, it's this one, it's that one, it's not you, I think that's troubling to the judge, and it may play a big factor with regard to what the judge does. And we'll certainly hear Trump saying a lot of things between now and then. I'd be careful.
I'm going to go on a limb here and say at this news conference that Donald Trump will hold shortly, there will not be an expression of remorse or a taking of responsibility
You are a betting
for his
man.
action. But we'll
You
see.
are a betting man.
We'll see. Friday.